All right, since we didn't have any action items from the last book that we read, I thought maybe we could check in with how the bullet journal stuff is going.
Oh, fun. I like bullet journal stuff. I have mine right here.
All right, so you're still doing the same method. Nothing really has changed or evolved. You made it through the first migration, and you're pretty much sticking to the system, right?
I am. I actually am approaching quickly onto the second migration. What is today? Today is the 25th as we record this. And that means that in 6 days, I'll be doing a second migration. So by the time this episode releases, I'll be in the middle of my second one. So, yeah, no, I think it's going well.
Cool.
I'll stick to it for now.
Well, I will also stick to it, but not the bullet journal method, I'm afraid. Are
you officially saying you're done with quote unquote bullet journaling and just doing something on your own? What are you doing?
I don't know. I guess I'm hacking my own bullet journal, which is not a bullet journal, but I've still got my fancy notebook that I am writing in every single day and time blocking and planning the night before and using as my daily log. And I've kind of gone through some testing. What am I going to do with all these things that I capture in here? And I actually made this great big diagram, which I can actually show you this. I sat down and I tried to figure out where all the pieces fit in my workflow.
Within the disk setup?
Well, so this is kind of messy at the moment. It's gotten simpler since then, but basically thinking through okay, so I've always got the bullet journal with me. Where's that going to go? What types of things am I going to put in here? Yada, yada, yada. And I think I've landed on the bullet journal is going to be the thing that I'm going to use to plan my day doing the time blocking. I pick a couple of tasks and then log everything. But then once it gets logged there, it's going to go somewhere else. And for me, it's not going to be the moving them to the different monthly logs or to the different collections. The more I play with Realm Research, that's going to end up being my collections because stuff just connects.
Sure. Now for Inside Baseball, Mike and I are doing our first ever recording of this with video on. And Mike just showed me a picture of this. So can you drop a picture of that into the show notes?
Yes, I will drop a picture in the show notes. I'll try to do while we're recording here. But yeah, it's basically just thinking through the GTD style decision tree is kind of how it started. And then I realized as I started drawing this, I've got a bunch of different things, a bunch of different places, and it was more complicated than I needed it to be. I've been kind of neglecting my task manager anyways. And then I started digging into some of the cool stuff that people are using Roam for. I remember talking about Scrum and wishing we could do something like that inside of OmniFocus, and you hacked together some way to do it. Well,
I put scripts together to force it into place.
Yeah. So basically with Realm Research, you can do Markdown style Kanban boards in the middle of it. And then the things that you put on the Kanban board are linked to pages, which could be your project pages. And it just, I think this is probably the thing that will work for me in terms of the creative stuff, which is primarily what I do. It's definitely not something if you were trying to work with clients and manage the emails that they send you and stuff, you're not sending those into Roam. But in terms of connecting ideas and creating stuff, it's a pretty cool tool. I shared a video with you and I also tweeted it, but I can include it in the show notes also about how I take I'm just playing with it still, but basically what I wanted to build was a cross-reference library of all of the sermon notes that I've taken. So I took the sketch note that I exported as a PDF, put it inside of Roam because it can handle attachments. And then I've got this nomenclature that I use, these boxes around the scriptures that are used. So I create a list of all of those, link those to a specific block, which has that particular verse on it, so that when I look at a page for my sermon notes, hopefully you follow along here, you click on the verse, it takes you to the verse page, and it also shows you, because of the way Roam is built, all of the other pages that have a link to that or mention that verse. So it's basically my own cross-reference library as I build this thing out over time. And I think there's a lot of cool ways to do that, not just with the sermon notes, but just the ideas that we read about in these books. I know we've, one instance that comes to mind is the story of the Polgar sisters, the chess champions. We've heard that multiple places, right? So I could just have that in the quick bullet list of the MindNode file that I upload to Roam. So I still have my MindNode file. That's where I'm taking everything. or taking all my notes, and that ends up being in the club as well. But then just real quick, distilling that when I'm done with a book, 5-10 minutes, transfer the important bullets into Rome. And then I have those pages created where I can see all of the different books that we've read that have referenced that particular story. And seeing those connections kind of opens up some interesting doors sometimes. And I think the more that I build into this, the more valuable those cross connections are going to become, but still early days.
Sure. Yeah, I still have yet to... Can you just go sign up for an account with Rome, or do you have to be approved before you get into it?
Thomas Frank created a video on it, and it blew up. He's got a couple million YouTube subscribers.
Sure.
So after that, they shut it down, but I believe they just let in a bunch of new people. You have to request access at the moment, and I'm sure they're going to start charging pretty soon. It's a pretty solid app. I mean, it's obviously still in beta and there's some rough edges, but it's pretty incredible once you get some stuff into it. And really it's garbage in, garbage out though, which is why I think it took me a while to get on board the Rome train. Is I was just toying with it, and you really can't do that with Rome. You really have to have like a specific use case you're going to solve, which for me was like the cross-reference library, the sermon notes, or be all in with it. And I kind of like dipped my toes in it for a while and wasn't getting a lot of the benefit. But I think I see it now. And the more I think about like the bullet journal, I definitely want to keep this piece. I know, by the way, it's interesting. Some people have said they've like abandoned their bullet journal in favor of Rome, and I can see how that can happen. But I still am 100% behind the analog download of the bullet journal. So
yeah,
I think
we got you hooked.
Yeah, exactly. So that piece isn't going anywhere. It's just where do things go from there? And instead of sending it to multiple places, it makes sense to send it to Rome, because I don't have 100 different tasks that I have to do this week. And I don't have to make sure all those things get done. I've got a couple projects I've got to finish. So all of those notes can just be with that project, and Rome makes it very easy then to connect that and just, manage the progress of that project via the Kanban board and stuff like that. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. I was asking about like getting into Rome just because like I've debated just looking at it and exploring it, but at the same time it's like, okay, the things that it would like the holes that it would fill are very, very small.
Sure.
This is not a thing that I'm looking for something huge to take over and replace, because I have a lot of already well-developed note-taking systems that link to other notes the way I want already. So I know this is like your mission, Mike, to get me to try it, but I have a long ways to go. At the moment between bullet journaling, and I'm an NV Ultra / NV Alt user. So that means I end up not understanding a lot of the detail that goes into Rome, like why people are super excited about it. But I could probably rant on that for a while, but won't. I will not do that.
I can tell you, I mean, if you're just looking for an Evernote type thing, then don't even waste your time.
Right.
But if you are interested in trying out a Zettelkasten, then I think this is the right tool for the job. In fact, I think my gap book this time is going to be to go back and read how to take smart notes again.
What?
now that there is a tool that I believe can actually accomplish this.
Sure.
Because I remember being skeptical the first time that we read through it, like, well, this sounds too simple.
Right. I'm scanning my bookshelf, which is right above my desk, and the way that I'm scanning for this is for the inverted spine, because I remember it was wrong.
Right.
It's like I located it and it's backwards.
Yep.
Okay. I can't tell if I'm excited for you or worried going through that one.
Give me a couple of months and then you'll either be on board or send help.
Sure. All right. So bullet journaling, still a thing I'm doing. You're exploring Rome. We've talked about that the last couple times, but you've got something new that released here last Thursday, right?
Yes. So we are talking about habits today. And one of the reasons that I picked this book as a gap book a long time ago was that we have been working on a course for habits for the Sweet Setup. So there is now a course called Simple Habits, which is 6 different videos on the concept of habits and how to track them, analog, and the importance of all that, like the building blocks of habits, basically. And then there's a whole bunch of bonus stuff, which is interviews. Like I've got one in there. Sean's got one in there. Sean McCabe has one in there. I forget some of the people that have them in there, but those are actually the cool part, in my opinion, is seeing like the ways that other people have hacked their habits. So there's some step-by-step videos, me talking in front of the camera, kind of walking through the building blocks. And then it's like, okay, so now you know what the components are. You can kind of use these to build your own habits. And then you get a whole bunch of examples of some really smart folks that are doing that. So it is at thesweetsetup.com/habits, and it is a $39 course. The videos themselves to go through it is probably only a couple of hours tops. So it's not something that you need to worry about investing a ton of time into.
Sure. Which is probably good, because the people who need to build good habits likely don't have them.
Yep, exactly.
It's like, okay.
Yeah. But like I said, it's not just the information that I think is cool about this. I think it's the examples of like the ways that people are doing this. So like one quick example from the course, which I thought was brilliant and really got me thinking, is this whole idea of habit stacking, right? We've talked about habit stacking before. We'll probably talk about it again today. But Sean's got an example of habit stacking in that course where he takes like every morning he gets up, and he's written about this for the Sweet Setup, how he writes for an hour on his iPad before everybody else gets up. And he turns on the coffee, everything is set out, it's ready to go, and then he starts writing. And he wanted to start taking vitamins, so he put the vitamins on top of the coffee so that he physically has to touch the vitamins to open up the coffee to, and just that little thing has caused him to take vitamins consistently, which is the exact type of thing that I've struggled with in the past, where it's like, well, sure, I know I should do that, but it's too much work. I forget it. Right. And so it's those little things I think that are valuable, where you see like, oh, I could totally see how I could apply this thing that this person did in a different way. So yeah, that's the course. And I am pretty proud of how it turned out. Weirdly excited about this one, and email are kind of the things that I get excited
Sure.
about. Most people are like, oh, no.
Yeah, I feel like we have a thing for habits. When I was scanning my shelves for how to take smart notes, I was looking at like all the behavior modification type books that we've done for bookworms. Like, how many habits books have we covered? Like point blank habits or disciplines, or yes.
There might be another one.
Yep. So here's another one today. Ready, set, go.
All right. So yeah, today's book is Tiny Habits by BJ Fogg. And this was something that I saw in the airport, actually, when I went to visit you, which seems like an eternity ago.
It does feel like it was a long time ago. It wasn't that long, though.
It wasn't.
It really wasn't.
No. But yeah, so I saw it in the airport. I'm like, oh, that looks like an interesting cover. And then I dug into it a little bit, realized that BJ Fogg is the person who James Clear credits with a lot of the research behind Atomic Habits, and is basically the guy behind all of the habits. It sounds like he's been doing this for a really long time, and he's done behavioral design with clients for a long time, but he was kind of pushed to write this book a couple of years ago.
Right.
And he's got some stories, the beginning and the end, that kind of talk about that. But the interesting part of this book, in my opinion, is not those stories. It is the actual content, which gets into the mechanics of habits in maybe the best way that I have ever seen. What was your initial impression, this versus Power of Habit and Atomic Habits? How would you rate those three in your opinion? I'm not asking for like the star ratings, whatever, but like if you were to recommend one book on habits, is it this one? Is it James Clear? Is it Power of Habit?
Oh, that's a tough one. Because Atomic Habits clicked with the way my brain operates.
Let's assume that the person you're talking to confesses that they're really excited about habits and they really want to start building new habits, and you've got these 3 books in your hands, which one are you handing them?
Personally, I'm probably going to throw them Atomic Habits.
Really? Okay.
I think if you want to understand the technical details of it, I think this is the one, Tiny Habits is the one to go to.
Sure.
But the general person, I feel like, would get a better overview with Atomic Habits. That might be my bent and bias towards James Clear coming out, because I followed him for a long time.
Yep.
And I feel like I have a tendency to recommend him and his stuff a lot. So that might be part of that. So I purely logical rationale, this one's probably the one I should share. But I think my tendency would be towards Atomic Habits. But again, like even Atomic Habits, tiny changes, remarkable results. Like he's even got the homage paid to Tiny Habits in his subtitle. So
yep.
If you follow that, that would mean you probably should look at Tiny Habits first. Just my thought.
Yeah. So just what brought that on is I was talking to my dad, and he saw that I was reading this book, and he thought it was interesting, and he made the comment that Atomic Habits was too militaristic, and he said he defined it as Atomic Habits assumes that you have the willpower and the self-control to follow through and do the habits. And I thought that was an interesting point. So this one, he kind of talks about all of the factors that are at play that produce the behaviors, and the way that he describes them shows that it's kind of like an equation or a formula that you can modify. It's not just a did it work or did it not work, and try something else, which is kind of where I thought Atomic Habits landed. For me, the progression is the power of habit, looking at that cue, routine, reward, and being like, that's not right. There's something else missing there. James Clear interjecting the 4th step, where he calls it the craving, I believe, after the cue. So you have the desire to do something, and being like, okay, that makes more sense. And then he gets into like the habit stacking and things like that. And at that point of that book, I have to admit that I was like, okay, this is getting a little too complicated. And then this book, I start reading this, and he's got the Fogg behavior model. Maybe this is the place to jump into this first chapter here on the elements of behavior. This Fogg behavior model where B equals MAP, and he's got this graph of motivation and ability, and then this action line. So behavior basically equals motivation times ability times prompt. So the prompt is the cue, and this was the thing I had against the Charles Duhigg version, is the cue doesn't automatically, that prompt doesn't automatically mean that this routine is gonna happen. And then you've got the motivation and the ability. These are 2 factors, and then the prompt basically being the thing that, depending on where that is, that can trigger the whole thing. And this model, this harkens back to my college economics class in some ways. Maybe that's why I thought, when I saw this, it's like, oh, I get it now. But I do confess that when I got done reading this first chapter, I was like, why didn't anybody ever tell me this before? Like, I feel like I've read all the stuff on this, and this feels new.
Yes. Yeah, I was kind of flipping through. I grabbed the other 2 books, The Power of Habit and Atomic Habits, and was just kind of flipping through them. It's like, all of these habit books, they want to build these charts with the loops in them, and they want to show how like the cue, routine, reward piece from The Power of Habit, and James throws in a 4th element to that. But I guess if you start looking at those using this B equals map formula from BJ Fogg, like, yes, he has another formula, and it does have a cycle to it. When he gets later on, he explains that. But I think this is probably easier to understand as I'm thinking through those 3 setups. This one's probably easiest to understand as far as the different elements that go into a habit as opposed to the habit itself.
Sure.
If you get the difference there. So as opposed to like cue, routine, reward, that's what makes up a habit. This is more about how to get yourself to do those behaviors, which then can become habits.
Exactly. And that's the thing that was always missing, I think, with the Charles Duhigg thing, and which is why that particular habit loop never felt right to me. It's like, okay, that habit loop, once you start it, will keep going, but you got to start it somewhere, and the place to obviously start it is the cue. So your brain naturally, maybe this is just the way I think, and it's the fault is mine, not Charles Duhigg's, but it's like, okay, if you can control the cue, then you're good, or if you can change
get that one under my thumb, I'll be happy.
Yeah, or you already have the cue, there's nothing you can do about it, so all you got to do is change the routine, and then, I don't know, it just didn't seem that simple. So when he explained it in this book, I felt like this gave me anyways, when I read it, a lot more hope and like a greater sense of control over the process, because there's more factors at play here, and you can actually tackle any one of these, like this behavior equaling motivation, ability, prompt. Like if you were to take this graph, and he has a bunch of different examples of this in the book itself. There's a lot of these visuals, which are really cool. But if you are having trouble following through and doing an activity that you want to create, or stopping an activity that you want to eliminate, for example, you can locate where that would be on this two-dimensional graph. And then if the thing is not happening, you realize very quickly, well, you can either increase your ability to do this thing, or you can increase your motivation to do this thing to get that onto the right side of that action line. There's no one specific thing that is going to make the difference in every single case, which I think is actually very freeing. And it could seem like that's more complicated, like that's a bunch more stuff to figure out. But this whole book is basically about dissecting your current habits and recognizing what's going on there. And he's got a bunch of different exercises, the swarm of behaviors, all that type of stuff that helps you identify like the things that are creating the result that you're getting. And then I think, time will tell, I guess, but based on the stories that he shares, I feel like those types of things that he outlines in this book are much more useful than the straight up formulas that you get in the others.
I can't help but think like his particular behavior model is B equals MAP. So behavior equals motivation, ability, and prompt. And in my head, I feel like this particular formula is likely to stick longer, only because I'm used to looking at bitmap images, and I can't help but see BMAP.
Yeah.
I see bitmap in my head every time I see B equals map. So
sure.
Just that, I don't think that's intentional at all, but I might actually remember this one better this way.
Yep. Yeah, and the way that these work, I mean, it's not rocket science. This book is probably longer than it would have needed to be, but I don't think it's too long, to be honest. Like he's attacking the same concepts from different angles, but it does feel like the different chapters that we're going to cover here, they are appropriate. But even in this first section, he's talking about the troubleshooting of behavior and how you shouldn't start with the motivation. You should check and see if there's a prompt, first of all, and then you should see if you have the ability to do the thing. And then if those things are present, then you see if the motivation is there. And that can be troubleshooting a behavior that you want to do that you're not doing, like starting a journaling habit or whatever. Or it could be reverse engineered if it's a negative habit that you want to break, which he has issues with that word break, which we'll get into here. Maybe this would be a good spot to actually go into that second chapter on motivation, and the subtitle here is Focus on Matching. You have anything else you want to say about the first chapter?
No, I don't think so. I keep thinking through things to talk about that revolve going into the next 3 chapters, so I'm good with that.
Okay. So this next chapter then is talking about the motivation part of the what's the term for this graph? I mean, I know it's the behavior model, but there's got to be a better way to describe it. I'll just use that for now, for the Fogg behavior model. So when I'm saying the Fogg behavior model, I'm talking about motivation, ability, and then the action line. And then he's got a million different versions of this to illustrate examples that he's talking about. But in this particular one, I thought it was cool where he shows that there are conflicting motivations. And later on in the book, he talks about some of these being like hope versus fear. And recognizing this, I think, is really important. So in this particular graph, the motivation is on the y-axis. So the motivation arrows are pushing up from the bottom and down from the top. And he's got a smiley face. Well, actually, it's just a face. He's not smiling. And locating that particular point on the graph, and then its location as based in relation to the action line determines whether it's happening. So obviously, the takeaway here is that the motivation can be the trigger between you following through with the activity or not following through with the activity. But he also talks about how it's unreliable in this particular section. I thought it was interesting how he talks about the difference between aspirations, outcomes, and desires. I thought this was the best description for why I don't like goals that I've found so far.
Yes.
He describes
100%.
He describes goals as aspirations and outcomes, which outcomes are measurable achievements, aspirations are abstract desires, but really what matters, according to this Fogg behavioral model, is the behaviors, which is something that you can do right now or at another point in time. And I feel like understanding that is a key piece going forward.
Yeah, I was looking at some of my notes for this particular book, which are in my bullet journal. Happy to say it's page 12 if you want to know. And I have a note here to start using the term aspirations instead of goals. So if I have an action item from this particular book at the beginning, because I actually didn't write any action items down on this, and this is like the perfect book for action items. I should say that, because it's like it's explaining how to do the right action and behavior. It's just like detailing it. The whole book is about that, and yet I didn't put anything down. So yes, the term aspirations instead of goals, like that just made a lot more sense to me because I hate the term goals anymore. So having something that would just be, this is something I want to get to, that made so much more sense to me. I like it.
Sure. Well, regarding action items, I don't have anything specific either, but I will say that as I was thinking about this yesterday, putting together this outline, I realized that my action item is simply going to be rethinking my morning and evening routines, which sounds like a total cop-out action item because I've done it before, but I feel like I am better armed with the information now to really make this stuff stick. I've got the analog tracking of my journals or my habits in the back of my bullet journal, and I'm recognizing that there are some that I am having some trouble with and things that I want to implement on a regular basis. So I'm going to take this approach, and he's got the 7 steps in the behavior design. I'm going to basically kind of go through this with my different habits. And I don't think that next time we'll be able to say, yes, these have been successful. Maybe I'll be blown away by how easy they are now that I understand the different components and I analyze this stuff under a microscope. But I don't expect that. What I do expect is that thinking about these things and just identifying what are the little behaviors I can do to make these easier to follow through with, that's going to have a positive effect.
Is there a specific piece of those routines that you've been struggling with you'd be willing to talk about?
Well, there's a couple things that are just rock solid, and that is the Bible reading in the morning, the prayer every day, stretching, and the ones that are a little bit more difficult for me are journaling at the end of the day using the daily reflection template instead of day one. I've been pretty good with that one, but it's not 100%, and I just want to figure out why that is difficult for me to do. Like I get the notification from day one, it's time to journal, 9:00, I tap it, goes to the reflection template. But for whatever reason, when I get that notification, I find myself resisting it, and I want to think about why, because I confess this is an important thing for me, so I have to figure that part out.
Sure.
The other thing I really want to think through, I have an inversion table in my bedroom, for crying out loud, but I can't follow through and use it for a couple of minutes every day. I do my stretches no problem, which happen 3 feet from the inversion table, but for whatever reason, it's like, okay, I got to start my day, and I just completely skip the stretching with the inversion table, which I know impacts me. If I skip it a couple days in a row, then I do start to have some neck and some back pain. It's not major. The stretching deals with a lot of the sciatica stuff that I was experiencing every once in a while. So it just doesn't hurt enough, I guess, for it to
Sure.
stick. And I want to figure out how I can make that a part of the morning routine.
This is not related to this particular thing, really, but I recently, it was my wife's birthday this past Friday. It's partially why we didn't record on Friday. And the main present I gave her was a weighted blanket.
Yes.
So she's been using that the last few nights. And it's just kind of tentatively seeing what the results are going to be from that. So it's been kind of an interesting thing for her. Again, I have no idea how that's related. Just a thing I needed to get off my chest. Hashtag ADD.
We also have a weighted blanket on our bed, and we absolutely love it. So
I think, as we're looking at, where am I at on this process? Motivation. As I'm looking at this particular aspect, one of the things he talks about in this section is the motivation monkey, and how this monkey has a tendency to convince you that you can do all the hard things at the beginning, which is true. Again, hashtag ADD. I can start new things every day of the week and be just fine. Like, it does not bother me. That stresses some people out. It's like, it's just another day for me. And it's very common, if you've worked with or around me, you know that has a tendency to wane after a short period, and then I move on to something else. So one of the things that Joe has to figure out is how to get things to last longer, as opposed to allowing this monkey brain to just jump from thing to thing, which was, when I got to this particular section, this was one of the pieces that I was fairly excited about reading through, was just giving terminology for that. And I say that because I haven't always had a good way to say, I jump from new thing to new thing, but why? Why don't I stick to something for a long period? And, if I have any major takeaway here, it would be to try to figure out how I could eliminate some of that. I think there's a lot of potential with it, but I also don't know all the answers there. But I do think this was an interesting piece to work through, because I haven't really thought about it, like the whole peaks and valleys of motivation, and should you do something about that? Should you take advantage of it? Is it a bad thing? He actually says it's a good thing in a lot of ways. It's very good to have that big spike of motivation at the very beginning when you first buy a house. That was one of the examples he gave in that case. But you have to be aware that it is going to trail off, and you have to know what to do about it.
You absolutely need to know what to do about it. And this is, I think, one of the things that was an aha moment for me in this chapter, and one of the things that gives you a little bit of more understanding and therefore a little bit more hope, is this motivation wave that's tied with the motivation monkey that you were talking about, combined with the common trap being that we overestimate our future motivation. So the motivation wave comes, and basically you can convince yourself to do something once, and then you wonder why it doesn't stick. And that's because you had this high point in your motivation, and then after that it died off. And of course, if you look at it scientifically, according to this model, you aren't able to sustain it, but you just beat yourself up because you're like, what's wrong with me? I don't have any self-control. Yeah, I don't have any self-control or willpower, So the steps in this behavior design process, by the way, he only talks about a couple of them in this particular chapter. He builds out the rest throughout the book, but I jotted down all 7 of these. This is a key part to the book. Step 1 is to clarify the aspirations. Step 2 is to explore the behavior options. Step 3 is to match with specific behaviors. Step 4 is to start tiny. Step 5 is to find a good prompt. Step 6 is to celebrate success. Step 7 is to troubleshoot, iterate, and expand. So I know that's a lot there, and probably doesn't even make sense the first time that you hear this, which is why he reveals it piece by piece over the rest of the book. That part, by the way, was a little bit annoying because I jotted down these 3 pieces, and then like every chapter later, I'm like, I got to go back and add one more there because I want these together,
Yep.
He's just taking
this is why you use paper and you just make a separate list for them, and you don't have to worry about that, Mike.
Well, it's no big deal. They are in a list, but it was annoying to me because he just takes his visual and he adds another step as he goes.
Right.
But having to go back to things over and over again was an interesting mechanic, I guess, is the best way to describe it, that we don't typically see when reading these books. Usually people will say, well, here's the whole seven-step process, or we're going to talk about all these. But he just gave you 3. And just like all the other pictures and models, they look complete, at that point in the book. So you jot those down, like, okay, moving on to the next thing. And he just comes back and he keeps adding to that, which I think is actually a pretty effective way of doing it. He also has a built-in review, because when you add step 4, you're also seeing step 1, step 2, step 3, and et cetera, as you progress through the book. So by the end of this, you feel like you've seen this a bunch of times already.
Which is helpful. The one piece of that whole process that really annoyed me is, and it was purely in my brain, it was not his fault at all, but I couldn't help but seeing one of those PowerPoint presentations where the thing slides in from the left, and then the next one slides in from the left, and they read it to you, and then it slides in and they read it to you. Like, that's what I had going through my head whenever I'd see those, which is not what it doesn't actually look like that. Somehow I just connected that. It drove me nuts. This is not BJ's fault. This is totally my fault.
Right.
But
yeah,
I couldn't help but see that. I kept wanting, I really wanted him to show all of those, and then just highlight the one he's talking about so you can see the whole thing.
Sure.
Like towards the beginning, because once I realized he was just adding to it after about the 3rd one, then I just wanted to know what the rest of them were. And I did something I haven't done in a long time, Mike. I skipped ahead until I found the last one.
I did the same thing.
And I read all the things, and then I went back and finished reading through it. I'm not somebody who does this, but it frustrated me enough that that's what I did in this case.
Yeah, after step 5, I did the same thing. Step 4 is like, oh, I got to go back to find that spot. And then step 5 is like, oh, you got to be kidding me. Let's get this over with.
Thanks for that. Thanks for making me feel better.
Yep. All right, so the next chapter is on ability. And this is really where he's talking about the power of the tiny habits, the small wins. And he's got this concept in this ability chapter of the ability chain, which I thought was interesting. It's basically a diagram of 5 interlinking chain links. And the 5 factors here are: do you have enough time to do the behavior? Do you have enough money to do the behavior? Are you physically capable of doing the behavior? Does the behavior require a lot of creative or mental energy? And does the behavior fit into your current routine, or does it require you to make adjustments? I never thought about this as a chain. I probably, even with those descriptions, would not have landed on the analogy of the chain. But I think this is effective because basically, if any one of these is broken, then the strength of the chain is gone and the habit fails.
Yeah, I like this whole visual of the links, because then it makes perfect sense. If you break any one of those pieces, the whole thing falls apart, and the behavior doesn't happen.
Yep.
So you can read that in a couple different ways. You can take all of these aspects of the ability chain and make sure that you do have them to make sure that you have the ability to do something. Or you can take advantage of this, and if you have a bad habit that you're trying to break, you can disable one of those.
Yep.
Create a problem in the chain, and then in theory, you don't do it anymore.
Exactly.
And if you do it, even though you tried to break it, that means you didn't actually break it.
Right. Which, again, we'll talk about the concept of breaking a little bit later, because he specifically calls that out in a later chapter.
Yep.
But I liked. Yeah. A lot of this stuff, you can tell he really knows this stuff, and he talks about it very intelligently and addresses a lot of like common issues. I shouldn't say common issues, unresolved issues in my head that I didn't know I had towards the topic of habits. If that makes any sense. He answered all the questions that I didn't know I had.
Yep. He did a good job of that too. I think, I didn't have anything major with this whole chapter of ability that I feel was groundbreaking, other than just being aware that the option or the talent or the skills or the opportunity to do a behavior is an important aspect in the process.
Yep.
So he does spell out early on in the book that, there are no behaviors that fall outside this formula.
Right.
Just none. And when you start evaluating each and every behavior that you do throughout a day, if you do that, I didn't, because it started to scare me after a little while. But whenever you do that, you realize, yeah, there are a lot of times when the ability to do something doesn't exist, or it does exist and you didn't realize it. And all it takes is a little tiny cue to set that whole behavior off.
Yeah, the two big things I think for takeaways from this chapter are the two questions that he poses as the discover question and the breakthrough question. The discover question is, what is making this behavior hard to do? And then armed with the ability chain that he identified, you can kind of go through those different steps and figure out what is the thing that's making it hard. And kind of vice versa, the breakthrough question is, how can I make this behavior easier to do? And this is the type of thing that I want to apply to my morning and evening routines. I feel like going through this process is going to give me some aha moments, but I haven't done it yet.
Yeah, I can't say that I've got a lot of behaviors that I'm trying to change right now, mostly because so much of my life is dictated for me that I don't have a lot of the options to change things. Thanks, coronavirus. There are some things that I want to do, but it's just not. I don't have the ability. If we use this terminology, the time for it doesn't exist. I have been able to reserve time for things like Bookworm, like what we're doing now, and a couple other small things like running sound for a band and live streams for them. Like I've been able to do some nights things, but the stuff in the morning that I feel like I want to do more of, just nope. I have to get to setups for the rest of my day. And now that in the state of Minnesota, things are starting to open up, so that actually gets worse for me now, because all the stuff I'm doing for live streaming still needs to happen. And we're going to bring people to the building now.
Yeah.
That's the best term I have for that. Like that's what's about to happen this week. So thankfully today is Memorial Day, and I don't have to do it today. We'll start tomorrow.
All right. The other thing I'll call out from this section before we move on to the next one is that if a behavior frustrates you, he says it will not become a habit. There are behaviors that frustrate me, and my lack of consistency when it comes to certain habits is frustrating to me. So that's kind of what I'm looking for when I apply this stuff, is to how do I kind of reverse engineer that stuff and hack that stuff? Because at the beginning, he talks about how the behaviors that you have, that's not really your fault. Like you are not your behavior. You're not a bad person because you have trouble meditating or you have trouble writing in your journal at the end of the day. The results that you're getting are because of the systems that are at place in your life. And it's not all tied to the motivation. He also mentions that at the beginning, that most people assume they just don't have the motivation to do what needs to be done. And he kind of explains that it's a bigger issue there, which is why he's talking about his individual pieces. But
yeah, I would say, just to piggyback off of that, that's a thing that I think is important here, because it's very easy to shame yourself with all of this. Like, this is something I do all the time, with my inattention on things. I forget things all the time, and I am behind on things pretty much constantly. So that means it's common for me to be frustrated with myself because I didn't do something. That's a normal daily experience in a lot of cases. So it's okay to miss. That's important, I think, is you can't continue to beat yourself up if you have missed things. It's okay. Just reevaluate and try again the next time. Like, to me, that's the important part here.
yeah, and that actually leads perfectly into the next chapter, which chapter 4 is on prompts, the power of after. And he mentions in this chapter that no behavior happens without a prompt. And if you were to dissect a lot of the things that you would typically get upset at yourself for failing to do, a lot of it has to do with maybe choosing the wrong type of prompt, an unreliable prompt, let's say. He mentions that there's 3 types of prompts here. Person prompts, which are those are the ones that are unreliable. That's seeing a person. Then there's context prompts, which are anything in your environment that cues you to take action, like a phone notification. And then there's action prompts, which is a behavior that you already do that can remind you about a new habit. And this is where like the coffee vitamins thing I think is really powerful. I think this is the one that has the most potential for me. I don't do all that great with the context prompts, as mentioned by my getting the day one notification and just dismissing it a lot of times.
Good job, Mike.
Yeah. So I want to reconsider how I can build in these action prompts, the things that I'm going to be doing anyways. And kind of side tangent here, this is the thing that concerns me the most about the bullet journal system is, yeah, you've got a great way to log everything and put it in the right place. And you look at you do all your migrations and your monthly logs get transferred over to your daily logs. But it just feels like because that relies on me, it's going to fail at some point. Like I need some sort of computer in the background telling me the important stuff that I'm forgetting. But also the notifications don't work. So what does that look like? Roam has this concept of like these daily pages where you can actually do task management inside of Roam. I'm not convinced that that's going to be 100% what I'm going to be doing, but
not exactly a brilliant idea.
In terms of the project pages and stuff like that, I think it makes a lot of sense. But I don't want to, when I open it up at the beginning of my workday, see the recurring tasks to take the garbage out at the end of the day. That's the piece that doesn't really fit right for me. But I do think that Roam specifically, I know we talked about this at the beginning, but kind of the reason I think this might work for me is because of this concept of the action prompts. I am always working on my computer. And so if Roam is open when I am on my computer, why not have everything that I need for the day right there in front of me, have all the things interconnected. I can find what I need. I can get the new ideas when I need them. That is appealing to me, but it's based on this shift from the context prompts to the action prompts. And I don't 100% know what this looks like in my life right now. I need to spend some time thinking about this and identifying what are the action prompts that are already there, and then leveraging those to build the new habits and the things that I want to do. But that's kind of where the action item comes in.
Sure. This is interesting to me because as I was going through like people, context, action prompts, far and away the most successful prompts I have are context prompts.
Okay.
100%. Like that's that's where I land. And I think it's because if it shows up on my phone, like an alert of some kind, I am much more inclined to either ignore it or just clear it to get it to go away, even though I didn't actually read it in a lot of cases. Like I have a tendency to do that, which is bad because it means I miss text messages, I miss phone calls, I miss a lot of stuff. But I will rarely miss making bread when we need it, because as soon as we get low on bread, I take my sourdough starter and set it on the kitchen island the night before, because the first thing I'll see when I go to the kitchen in the morning is that sourdough starter sitting on the kitchen island, which then is like, oh, I need to do that. And immediately I'll start the process. But I always leave the thing of bread wherever I need it so that I remember whenever I get to those spots, I take care of it. Like I do that a lot. Even with reading my book, in this case, reading Tiny Habits, I'll set it on the couch in our living room the night before. So that way, whenever I come downstairs in the morning, it's the first place I go because it's where the dog sleeps and I want to go pet the dog in the morning. So my book is sitting there. It's like, oh yeah, I should read this morning. Despite how many years have we been reading books, and I still have to have this silly prompt in the morning to help me make sure that I follow through on that. So these context prompts are huge for me. So it's interesting to me that they don't work for you. It feels to me like that would be the brilliant thing to do, but
well, they do work, but not all context prompts are created equal, and that's the interesting thing to me. He's got a Tiny Habits recipe, he calls it in this chapter, where you've got an anchor moment, and that anchor moment, I think, is triggered by one of these prompts, but you have to figure out what are the prompts that are going to work for you in that specific context, or that context refers to a type of prompt. So maybe that's a bad word choice there. But given your environment, you have to have the right prompt to trigger the thing. And then after the anchor moment, you've got the tiny behavior. And then after that, you've got a celebration. So this another concept in this chapter is this behavior sequencing, where you're deciding what action should come after the current one. And he says that reliable habits are simply coding things in the correct order. So the visual context prompt of the book, that's going to work in one scenario, but just seeing something and having it be, oh yeah, I've got to do this, and then you follow through and take action on that in a different scenario is probably not going to work. So I think this is a little bit more complicated, but this is where I want to spend some time and identify this stuff. Apparently, my mind is a complex forest that must be navigated through. I don't know.
That doesn't happen.
I mean, the more I got into this book, the more I was able to see some of the things that didn't work that I was relying on. And that was kind of cool to see because, again, it kind of gave me some hope where, like, somebody told me this one time, it sounded really good. I thought it made sense, so I tried it. It doesn't work for me. What's wrong with me? And this is kind of like, well, no, it's not that there's anything wrong with you. It's just that you tried this particular context prompt. Maybe you need to try a different action prompt to trigger this behavior or whatever. And so I want to go through the exercises. Every single one of these chapters has different exercises at the end of it. And I want to go through those and rethink all the different pieces. Basically what I did when I shared this in the chat for the people who are listening live, the diagram of like all the different pieces of the productivity system, which again, like that's an older one. It's going to be a little bit simpler than that. But just doing that exercise brought a lot of clarity to me on like how the pieces connect. And I feel like I can do the same sort of thing with my habits, but I have to really dive in there and see what's really there before I can fix it.
Yeah. Makes sense. I feel like there's a lot of different ways you can take this and a lot of different things that you can set up. One of the things I was debating in this process is just, he has a system of sorts to identify what the behaviors should be given an aspiration that you want to achieve. You have an aspiration of, I want to lose 20 pounds. Or in my case, it's probably more like gain 15 pounds. But if you have that aspiration, that's not a thing you can just go work towards. Like one of the examples he gives earlier on is around I forget the name of the company. There was a company that had an initiative to help people save $500. And they thought that was the action, like it was the thing that people needed to do was save $500. And he made a point and said, okay, all of you right now at this moment in this room, save $500.
Yeah. And then they laughed and then they were like, oh, I can't do that right now.
Do that. Yeah, exactly. Like you can't just stop and save $500. So what are the behaviors that you need to do in order to achieve that aspiration, since that's not an actual behavior? I think when you evaluate things in that way and start determining what the behaviors are that you need to be performing in order to achieve that aspiration, it becomes more and more apparent what the current MAP, the motivation, ability, and prompt system is that you need to have in place to actually achieve that. That whole system of taking the time to evaluate each individual behavior is something I've never considered. I don't think I've ever sat down and said, hey, I need to rethink how I'm doing my journaling process at night, or I want to start doing yoga in the morning. What is going to be my motivator for that? How am I going to make sure I have the ability to do that in the morning? And what am I going to prompt myself to do it at that time? All of those things are pieces I just have never really considered. So going through these three different pieces, I guess I'm kind of summarizing the first 4 chapters here, but like going through that particular process and just understanding each individual component of this behavior equals motivation, ability, and prompt setup, like just going through that, I think was helpful. I didn't really expect it to be that helpful, but it made a lot of sense.
Yeah, you feel
Stop
like
rambling.
you should have a handle on this habit stuff because we've read all of the books on it already, right?
Yes. How many books have we read about stuff like this? Like, Make Time had it in there.
Yep.
Indistractable has
Yep.
it in there. The 3 habit books now, like there's tons of these that have habit forming stuff in it. And we still read a book on habits and find it interesting.
Yep. And learn a bunch of stuff from it. Yeah.
Yes.
Exactly. Now the next chapter, number 5, emotions create habits. This kind of breaks away from the Fogg behavior model in the B equals MAP. This talks about the emotions behind the habits, which are kind of linked to your motivation probably. But this is where it gets into the spectrum of automaticity. Is that how you say that? I'm not quite sure.
Automacity?
I
don't know.
Yeah. Basically,
Automaticness.
how automatic a habit becomes. And the better you feel about it, the more automatic it's going to become. So this was kind of an aha moment for me here in this particular chapter where he talks about by feeling good at the right moment, you can cause your brain to recognize and encode the sequence of behaviors that you just performed. Now, this doesn't really seem that revolutionary if you really think about what is going on when you're trying to build habits. But he also says in this chapter that habits can form quickly in as little as a couple of days, which sounds blasphemous when you read the other stuff because we were told a long time ago habits takes 21 days to build a habit. And then you were told, actually, no, it's probably more like 66. Actually, no, there's a lot going on here. It could be as much as 200. And I think all of that is true, but I've never heard it the other way where you can basically accelerate the creation of the habit if you have a strong emotion attached to it. Although I 100% believe that. After he explains it, that does make a lot of sense. I think it's probably dangerous to assume that you will be able to create a habit in only a couple of days. But I think the takeaway here is figure out how you can attach a strong positive emotion to a habit, and that will decrease the amount of time it takes in order to make it automatic and reduce the level of motivation and ability that's required in order to get it to happen.
When you think through habits and what has you operating under those habits, maybe that's the way to say that. For example, the morning routine and such that I go through, which is fairly basic at this point. It's like I'll spend a little bit of time reading in whatever book we're reading for Bookworms, since it's like the only time I have for reading books, like the only books that I have time for reading. And following that, I go through my morning bullet journal process, and then I'm off to making breakfast with the girls and breakfast with them. And that's the sum total of it. But when you look at those, I feel better about my day if I've had the time to read. And I feel better about my day if I have it prepared from a task stance via bullet journaling. So like the emotion from that is one more around security and borderline motivation to go do things for the day. So, and again, whenever you start evaluating all of the behaviors that you do, like what is the emotion that drives that? Usually there's some form of a feeling, a good feeling, maybe a fear of not getting it done. There's always something that quote unquote prompts you to actually follow through on that. So yes, I feel like emotions are important, but at the same time, I understand that these are things that come as a result of having done it. It doesn't really work the other way, I don't think. Like you're hoping that an emotion comes through, but having an emotion doesn't necessarily. Well, maybe it does. Maybe I'm going backwards on myself now that I say that. Do emotions come first or last?
Yes. So
Thanks, Mike.
He talks about the 3 moments for celebration, and they are when you remember to do your new habit, while you're doing it, and immediately after doing your new habit. And I didn't find this entirely helpful because I couldn't think of an example of how I would want to apply that personally. But I understand those 3 moments and where you could interject small celebrations at those different places if you really were having trouble getting a habit to stick, which again, maybe I need to do that. So I mentioned at the beginning, this is my action item to reconsider my habits and take a look at the ones I want to create and figure out what I need to do in order to do that. So maybe this is a piece of that. I don't know. But at the moment, that's not something that I do. One thing I do a pretty decent job of is celebrate accomplishments, which this isn't exactly habit related, but he does say at the beginning of this chapter, and I think this is a really important point, that adults usually have many ways of saying I did a bad job and few ways of saying I did a good job. Now, I shared before we hit record, I got a fancy new pen as a celebration for a project that I completed. And this is more and more, I realize, becoming an important part of my creative workflow. Yes, my fancy fountain pen collection is growing, but it's growing by me buying a pen to celebrate something that I did. And every time I pick up that pen to use it, I'm reminded of, oh yeah, I shipped that thing. I finished that thing. And these, again, this doesn't pertain to habits necessarily, because these are bigger things that take, a month, 3 months, 6 months, sometimes even longer than that to get done. I'm not buying a fountain pen every time I remember to go for a run.
You have a lot of fountain pens, Mike.
Yeah, and that's really what he's talking about in this chapter, is those little things where, like, you smile in the mirror, as an example, or you say a specific word or phrase out loud. But I do think you could take that concept and apply it on a larger scale, and that's something that I'm already doing, and I'm seeing the effects of that. So this is something that I realized that I do tend to be my own worst enemy, my biggest critic, and beat myself up about all the things that I did poorly. So I recognize that I do fall into this category that he outlines at the beginning of this chapter. And I know that I do probably need to figure out additional little ways of telling myself that I am doing a good job. Because if I'm not careful, then I can find myself putting my mental state into that category of like, oh, you worthless piece of scum. You can't do anything right. I think that building these things into your habit routines could be a very effective guard against that and maintaining a positive mental state, which has benefits, not just your productivity, but it seems easy to say, well, this is important. It's going to have an emotional benefit. But I think especially where we find ourselves now, like everybody's in the middle of a pretty big emotional turmoil, going through all of this COVID-19 stuff. I mean, even people who haven't really been affected, like I didn't lose my job. On the surface, you could say, well, you've got it pretty good. You don't really have any reason to be upset by any of this stuff, but things are different. And just recognizing that things are different, there's a bunch of things that are at play there. I relish the additional time that we've had with our family, but it can also be stressful too. My wife and I were talking about that. Like we go to bed exhausted every single night because there is no break. I can't get in the car and listen to a podcast while I'm driving to the co-working space before I start working. As soon as I open that door, daddy. Which again, it's not something I'm complaining about, but recognizing that does drain you.
Yeah.
And it's not something that maybe we were used to. So recognizing that this is a tank that gets depleted a little bit more quickly than it did a couple of months ago. That is step one. Step two is recognizing what are the things that you can do to help refill that tank. And I 100% agree that the miniature celebrations will do that.
In the members chat, Tied Up mentioned having to remove the Pen Addict podcast. Listening to them causes the purchase of too many pens, Mike.
Yes.
Which I think is actually how you got into this. You started listening to the Pen Addict podcast and
I did.
Whoops.
Okay. So, soapbox moment here for a second.
Whoops. Sorry, folks.
We mentioned somebody had asked for clarification on how they could join the membership community for Bookworm. We mentioned this at the beginning and the end of the podcast a lot of times, but there is the podcast you can download, listen to for free. There's the Bookworm Club that Joe created where you can go discuss the books that we're reading. There is also a paid membership, which is $5 a month for people who just want a way to support the show. And there's a couple of bonuses that come with that. There's the live chat that we've mentioned here, the MindNode files that I create, I upload those to the members area, so you can download those for yourself for all of the books that we cover, wallpaper, stuff like that. But I would guess that the majority of people who join that don't do it because of what they get. They do it because they want to support the show and support the people who make it, which I think right now is really important. And I am officially a paying member of the Pen Addict. I don't even know what the membership is, but the $5 a month.
It doesn't matter. You're paying.
I get the newsletter just because I want to support Brad and Mike and the whole, like, Brad's got a whole bunch of people that contribute to the Pen Addict site, and including Jeff Abbott, who does some stuff for the Sweet Setup too. So yeah, I'll just throw that out there that now is as good a time as any to support the creators that you like.
Kind of coming back to the book, I am curious about your thoughts on the Maui habit, because one of the things, so the Maui habit, what he talks about is that when you first get up in the morning, you look in the mirror, look yourself in the eyes, and say, today is going to be a great day. Okay? Take that concept in light of a book we just did a couple rounds ago, maybe it wasn't that many rounds ago, The Antidote, and how positive thinking is not the way.
Yeah.
Like, okay. So in light of that, one of the things I debated was translating that to, this could be my last day. That way you still have like the driver towards a productive day and a successful day. But at the same time, you're not falling down that trap of positive thinking per se. But I was curious about your thoughts on this. Like that was going through my head, and I haven't fully figured out all of my thoughts around that yet. But I'm curious what you think.
I think that if you're going to pick one side to err on the side of positive. But that's me personally, because I have no trouble flipping over to the negative. That's my default a lot of times.
That's fair.
So I could see a scenario where those are flip-flopped, but it also makes no sense to me why you would choose to dwell on the negative stuff. I think that The Antidote, the way that book was written, we kind of talked about this in that particular episode, where it was kind of like a mention of a specific topic like Stoicism, and then a story to support their view, but it felt like not a complete picture and not a fair discussion about some of those topics. And I still feel that way. I feel like if you're going to pick one approach as scientifically correct, you have to side with the PhD behavioral designer. This just makes so much more sense from a analytical, logical point of view, which is the way that my brain is wired. Now, like I said, I can totally see why that wouldn't work for some people, but I have no problem embracing the Maui habit and the positive approach to building habits over the antidote.
I don't usually pass a mirror in the morning, so I don't have the opportunity. So the ability is not there, Mike.
I will say that the Maui habit specifically, I don't think I even wrote that down in my outline, because it's not something that I have any interest in doing specifically. Sure. We do have a mirror, but when I heard about that, I was kind of like, yeah, no, I'm not going to do that. But nice. Like I said, I do think that if you're going to pick one of those, then in terms of habits specifically, I think you have to focus on the positive if you believe in this Fogg behavioral model, because the motivation that could also be, you could also, I think, reframe that as a positivity meter, if you will. And he does have examples of like negative peer pressure, how that can create motivation and kind of be fear driven, but I don't think that's sustainable. I think the only sustainable way for this, healthy, sustainable way for this to really work, is to figure out how to apply a positive mindset and emotionally charge these habits so that you want to do them. He talks about that later on. I think I mentioned that earlier. You know, if a behavior frustrates you, it's not going to become a habit. Well, if it's fear driven, it's going to frustrate you. At least it would frustrate me.
Yeah, I wonder how many of my habits are fear driven sometimes. Like I have a lot of cases where I don't want to let someone down. Maybe that's a disappointment driver as opposed to fear driver. But I have quite a few things I do that float that line, which isn't good, I don't think, but it also helps me get things done. So I'm not sure how I feel about that.
Well, that's a perfect spot to go into the next chapter, which is number 6, growing your habits from tiny to transformative, because this is where he talks about the hope versus fear being the two vectors that push against each other, and the sum being motivation. Now, he does also mention in this section the examples of like being called out on a dance floor and you don't want to disappoint people, so you follow through and you do it, but that's really like fear driven, and even though it pushes you past the action line, you're feeling anxious and stressful, which I think is kind of what you're talking about with maybe some of your habits. And I have no doubt that I have habits that fall into that category too. But like I said, I view that as something that I want to change and make positive. And I think he would explain it in this book. I don't have a specific instance here, but I think he would basically say like, yeah, you have to rewire those and apply some positivity to it in order for it to really become something that is sustainable. I think I agree with that. And I don't know. I can't, that just sounds like not a very fun way to live. So why do that if you don't have to?
Right. I get you. It's not a thing I feel like I've wanted or specifically designed. I just think it's kind of where I've landed. I don't know if that's... I haven't tried to look back in time to see if that's a thing that I have done for a long period or if it's something that's more recent. I'm not sure what that is, but it is a thing that currently exists. And I haven't figured out what to do about that yet. I feel like it might help if I did my own celebrations, like taking advantage of the small rewards thing. But I hesitate going down the positivity route because that has bit me in the past, because it's given me a bit of a false sense of security in some things. So I hesitate to go down that road, but I know that it works for some folks. Obviously, it works for you. So it's not a thing I think I'm going to downplay by any means and say, hey, you should never do this. But it is certainly a thing that I personally hesitate with. Now, maybe that's because I have bad motivators in a lot of cases, and that would be the solution. Not discounting that, but it is a thing that makes me wonder. And I haven't figured out what the solution there is, but it was something that BJ Fogg was successful in bringing to light. So there's that. At least a kudos to Mr. Fogg in that sense.
Yeah, I think what you're describing can be summed up in the Bible verse that says, hope deferred makes the heart sick. And I think maybe that is what you're describing, where you focus on the positive and you get disappointed because you don't achieve the positive result that you thought you were going to get. And I think that's where goals are dangerous, but habits maybe are better. And then the whole idea of the tiny habits here being to break it down really, really small. So success is not, did you achieve an outcome or did you receive a result that you were aiming to, but did you do the tiny little activity and then did you celebrate immediately afterwards? And I think if you define positivity, that's probably not even a word. I keep saying it. You know what I'm talking about. That positive mindset, if you apply it in that sense, I think that is absolutely a positive thing. I don't know. I think the real trick of this is, and this is not simple, but control what you can control and then let the rest of it go. And I know that sounds way, 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 way too simple. I get that. But I also think that in terms of getting back control over different parts of your life, that tiny habits offer some hope where maybe there wasn't some before. Some of the stories that he shared in this are pretty crazy. One story in particular I'm thinking about, there was a lady who was in not a great relationship, but she also wasn't making a lot of money. and wasn't in a position to like leave the relationship. So she started employing tiny habits and celebrating her successes as she built up her own emergency fund so she could leave this toxic relationship. And I think that was a interesting example. I had issues with that specific example because after she left, turns out that they were able to work through their differences and now they're friends. And she's like, I can't believe it. And I'm like, well, of course I can believe it because you were so focused on leaving the relationship that you didn't spend any time working on it. If you would have worked on building the relationship instead of leaving it, maybe you could have saved it.
You had the wrong aspiration here.
But I digress.
Yes.
So there are a couple different skills of change, which I wanted to run through real quickly here. Number one is behavior crafting, which is selecting and adjusting the habits that you want in your life. And this right here, I think, gets back to the whole positive versus negative thing. If you are ascribing to the tiny habits model, you basically can't be negative, I think, because you are designing things that you want. So you have to have some bent towards the positive in order to identify those things in the first place. Otherwise, you're reacting to things. Maybe you tell me, is that unfair?
No, I think that's perfectly fair.
Okay. And then you've got self-insight, which is knowing which new habits will have meaning to you. And again, if you are focused on the negative side, you're kind of thinking like, well, self-preservation, I just got to endure all of the attacks that are going to come against me. Whereas positive, you're thinking, well, these are the things that are going to be a part of the life that I want to live. Step number 3 is the process. And that is knowing when to push yourself beyond tiny and to ramp up the difficulty of the habit. You can scale these things or you can multiply these things he talks about. Maybe that was the previous chapter. Number 4 is the context, which is redesigning your environment to make your habits easier to do. And then number 5 is the mindset, where you're embracing a new identity. I think if you're going to embrace a new identity, why not make it a positive identity? Maybe there's a way to embrace a negative identity with this, but I don't understand it.
Yes. There's a lot here. With this particular piece, to me, it made a lot of sense that this is where Atomic Habits jumped off. As you go through a lot of these, like he's explaining how to develop a specific behavior, and he doesn't really spend a ton of time explaining how to make it repetitive. Because the assumption is that once you figure out how to get those 3 components, motivation, ability, and prompt, if you get those 3 in place and it's successful, it just becomes a habit. It doesn't have to be a one-time thing. He does make the point that you can use this to tackle one-time behaviors. But this 6th section here, growing those habits, to me that makes perfect sense that that's where Atomic Habits jumps off, because it's a lot more about how do you develop a routine? How do you set yourself up to do these small things every single day? Whereas he doesn't really embrace the routine piece with this entire book. Yes, he does mention it, but it's not a core component like it is with Atomic Habits or the Power of Habit. Like it's not as vital in those specific cases. So it is interesting that he does spell out these specific skills. It is interesting to go through those, but it's also interesting, I think, that when you start comparing and putting these other books and layering them on top of each other, it's like, yes, you could use this as your starting point. See, you're convincing me that this is the one I should recommend out of the 3. Good job, Mike. So if you use this as your jumping off point and then come back over to Atomic Habits once you get through this to put the broader picture of the routine-based pieces in place, I could see a pretty powerful setup there. Interesting thing is how the Power of Habit doesn't really fit into that.
Yep, agreed. Although I would say that really the benefit of reading all of these books is that they all tie together and they fill in the holes. So like you were kind of mentioning the recurrence of these things, and he doesn't talk about that specifically, but there was a story in this section which I thought really exemplified a way that this could work as a routine, and that is the whole idea of the super fridge. Do you remember this?
No, I don't know why.
So this is in the context, but there's a bigger aspect of this than just the context. So they wanted to eat healthier, So what they did is they relabeled their fridge super fridge, and once a week they spend time prepping and organizing it so that when they want to grab a snack, everything is in the little containers and they just grab it from the fridge. So basically the food that is stocked there is ready to go. It's convenient, because that was one of the things that caused them to eat unhealthy, was the fact that nothing was ready. So they designed a way to show a bunch of healthy eating options whenever they open the fridge. And this, I think, exemplifies one of the strengths of this book, is that he's got all these little labels for things. And I feel like they're really effective. And some of the stories are really powerful. But if you were to break this down, basically what they are doing is they are reverse engineering their, if you were to go back to that cycle from the James Clear, the cue being that they're hungry, and then the routine. So they are using that model. Now, he uses this story specifically in skill set number 4, context. But I immediately thought of the James Clear model when they were telling this story. And basically, once you do that, now you have a reliable system in place where you constantly have healthy food that you can eat. So I do think they complement each other.
Sure. No, I think they do. And James Clear's book might be the bridge between them. Like between The Power of Habit and Tiny Habits, since he's pulling off of Charles Duhigg's pieces in order to get to his system. But, if BJ Fogg's research was a heavily used portion of writing Atomic Habits, that would make a lot of sense. It would.
Yep.
All the habits.
All right, let's go to the next chapter here, number 7, Untangling Bad Habits. And this is where he breaks down the issue with breaking a bad habit, where the term breaking a bad habit, he says, sets the wrong expectation. And he uses this analogy, which I thought this was brilliant. And if this was the only aha moment you got from this book, it was probably still worth the time to read it, where your bad habits are essentially a huge tangled knot. And what you have to do is you have to pick that all apart, little bit by little bit. It's not something that you just cut out immediately, which I think is what a lot of people, myself included, tend to fall into that mindset when you want to eliminate a behavior that you tend to do, whether that be eating junk food or binging Netflix at night, whatever it is. Everybody's got something that they kind of gravitate towards that they would confess that they don't want to do. And I feel like this is a helpful analogy in identifying the root causes that are there, because it's probably not just one thing.
Do you have a bad habit you're trying to break?
Good question. Nothing came to mind as I was reading this, but like I said, I want to put myself under the microscope for next time. So there might be something here. I can't think of it at the moment, though.
I have a tendency to use my breaks. I make sure I take breaks throughout morning and afternoon work sessions. I haven't gone full-blown Pomodoro, but I'm on the edge of saying that's a thing I should be doing. But I have a tendency to take those breaks and just watch a couple YouTube videos when I could definitely use that time to read a book or write my thoughts on something out or research something that might be helpful later. Watching YouTube really doesn't solve that, at least not in the way that I'm doing it. It's possible to use YouTube to learn new skills. The way I am using it does not.
Fair enough.
So yes, that's a thing I feel like I want to break, because I understand exactly what the prompt is with that, and the motivation's quite high to do that. So there are things I need to do in order to break it. But I haven't even tried yet, Mike, because frankly, I don't want to. But I should. I know I should.
Well, that is a larger issue there, because just the phrase, I should, why should you? If you enjoy YouTube, you don't necessarily, it's not necessarily a matter of you should stop doing that. Maybe you are spending 5 hours a day watching cat videos on YouTube, in which case
Well, it's not cat videos.
tech videos. I don't know.
Feeding my car obsession.
My thinking of that, I'm thinking back to Hyperfocus by Chris Bailey, and he's got that one graph where it's like useful versus entertaining, and maybe the way out of that, if it's really something that you want to change, is not to like stop it completely, but to replace some of those videos with educational YouTube videos. So they're like on the verge of things that you're interested in. Like I've got a Thomas Frank Rome research video I could send you.
Thanks for that. Appreciate that concept. You're helping a lot.
Or a TED Talk or something like that. I know you mentioned that you used to anyways, watch a bunch of TED Talks, because every time we would cover a book by somebody, hey, did you see the TED Talk? I'm like, nope, haven't.
Yep. I used to do a thing where I watched a TED Talk every morning.
Wow. So
that was a thing for a while.
And that's the kind of thing that I would envision if you were to take BJ Fogg's approach. That would be one of the substitutions that would probably happen there. He doesn't really talk about it in this particular section, I don't think, but there are these. He does kind of talk about how if you want to change from a negative to a positive, then there are different things that you can do to apply that. In this particular section, he's really talking about just redesigning things and eliminating them. So you redesign your ability to stop doing a habit where you make it harder to do, or you reduce the motivation to stop a habit. But I think there is a substitution option that probably would make sense here too. And again, it really depends. And this is the cool thing about this whole concept to me. This is why I find habits so fascinating, is that there is no single right answer to any of these specific problems. If you get joy out of watching the car videos, absolutely go ahead and watch the car videos, which is why I continue to listen to The Pen Addict and why I continue to do a bunch of other things, just because they're fun. And I think this is something that I'm not trying to counsel you at this moment. I'm trying to just explain, I guess, to the listeners who have been
fun.
There is nothing wrong with that. If you decide that this is important to me, you don't have to justify it to anybody. Now you can, if you want to, you can say, well, I should be doing something. And that word should, I think, is dangerous. But if you want to replace a behavior with a different behavior, there are ways to do that, but don't feel like you necessarily have to. Don't let anybody productivity shame you into letting go of the things that you simply find enjoyable, that you don't necessarily get a specific or explicit benefit from those things.
Yeah, I think the easy answer here is to replace, the motor-driven exploration of cars with learning skills. Like, for example, I've been doing tons and tons of live streaming, which has me on the edge of wanting to become a streamer right now, and have played around with that concept. If you think I should do that, maybe you should let me know, because I'm not a gamer, so it would not be gaming, which is partly why I was asking about how easy it is to get into Rome research, because I was debating doing a live stream, just exploring it, trying to figure out if I should use it or not. I don't know if that's of any interest to anybody, but that's a concept I've played with. It would be very easy for me to replace this bad habit, I'm going to call it a bad habit, with that learning habit, which would be better off in the long run, because there's tons and tons of videos to go through to learn things around streaming. It's like, I know the encoding part and I know how to push a stream out, but creating the engaging portion of it is a different game. So
sure.
I've done a lot of video work, just not in that way. That's the piece that I would be looking at. But all of that could come from breaking the bad habit, replacing it with a better one, which I think in the long run would be better off. But I still like cars, Mike.
Which is fine. That kind of gets into the skill set number 5, the mindset. I'm the kind of person who, fill in the blank, knows a lot about cars, or learns skills? I mean,
Yep.
you got to get more specific than that. What are you really trying to get from this, I think, in order for that to work? And if it doesn't work, I would say don't
Sure.
be upset that it's not.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about the last chapter here, which I don't have a lot to say about. Number 8, though, is how we change together. And this is really talking about applying the 7 steps that he mentions back in chapters 2 through infinity in a group context. I did appreciate in this section, each of these steps, he talks about this from 2 perspectives as the ringleader. So this is the person who is in charge of a group. And you can set the tone, and you can, if you own a business, say, this is how we are going to do things. And this is always one of the things that people push back against the most, I think, when it comes to this type of stuff, is that a lot of books presume that you have this sort of control over the groups that you are involved in. And he basically says that if you're not a ringleader, then you are a ninja and you need to sneak in behavior change wherever you can stealthily. I thought this was genius. And then he goes through each of the seven steps and talks about it from a ringleader perspective and from a ninja perspective.
Yeah. I think this is interesting because there are times when I'm definitely the ringleader and there are definitely times when I'm the ninja. But I feel like there's also times when I struggle to figure out where the difference is. And I say that because at the church, for example, I'm definitely the ringleader when it comes to producing our Sunday services right now from a technical stance. But from an overall event stance, I am not. I'm a big part of it, but I'm not the overarching. So even in one role, I feel like you can flip back and forth between those, because there are definitely some cases where I have, without having been through this, have been building in habits amongst my tech team to do our Sunday services. But in the overarching, having this terminology, I need to be more of a ninja to pull that off. So I haven't been doing that near as much, even though I've had the opportunity to do it a lot.
Yeah, I think you're right. There are going to be a lot of places where you're going back and forth between these two, and it can be difficult to find the balance there. But this is where the maxims that he shared earlier in the book, but he restates them here, are very helpful, I think. And these apply no matter whether you are a ringleader or a ninja. And that is, number 1, to help people do what they already want to do, and to number 2, help people feel successful. Not be successful, feel successful. And I think that's a really important difference there, but also going back to like the positive versus negative aspect, why like negative doesn't work with this model. You can't help people feel successful if they've simply avoided a negative scenario. You need to help them think that they have won, even if there is a larger victory to be gained. Helping them recognize that they have at least won this specific contest, this specific thing that's right in front of them. They were able to do this successfully and build some momentum. That is going to be important.
I think I'm out of thoughts, and I'm through all my notes that I have in bullet journal. What else do we say about this one?
I think it's time for action items then, which...
But we didn't write any down, Mike.
True. I did mention that I want to reconsider my evening and morning routines specifically. And I mentioned a couple of habits as we recorded this that I want to apply some of this stuff to and see if I can't get them to be a little bit more successful. So I'll make that an action item, although I won't bore you next time with a rundown of my complete morning and evening routines.
All right.
But I think that's really the only action item from this book that you could do is apply these principles and these exercises in some way, shape, or form. You could pick something specific, I guess. I'm reconsidering all of my morning and evening habits, which is only 6 of them. But I want to make sure that the foundation is solid for anything that I would want to add in the future. There are a couple things that I've kind of toyed with on and off and haven't really invested a lot of time into making those things be a part of the routine. And I also think that during a global pandemic, maybe not the time to try to establish a bunch of new habits. Interestingly, I do think that it is important to take a look at what is already there. And if you don't have solid habits, start building some positive ones, because this has kind of been a giant reset period for everybody. And so being intentional about the habits that are producing the outcomes that you're getting, this is probably a great time to consider that stuff. Just based on the title of the book, the way to implement those changes is not to do a bunch of big things. It is to identify some small things.
Yeah, I think as far as action items, I mostly just want to be aware. Like this isn't one where I feel like I have specifics. It's good to understand this process, and I'm likely to use it more for bad habits at the start, but I'm not sure what all that would be, save the one we've talked about. It is interesting that this made me aware of potentially negative motivators behind a lot of behaviors that I have. So that particular piece is one that's enlightening and interesting to explore. So maybe there's an action around that, but that's more of I'm going to ruminate on this over time scenario. This isn't I'm going to sit down and actively work through that. So I can't say that that's a thing I'm going to do. So I'm going to leave it at that. I'm going to just ruminate.
All right.
Can I do that? Is that allowed?
You can ruminate. I'll allow it. All right. Style and rating. I go first, correct?
Yep. Your book. You go first.
Okay. This is a little bit different than what I expected. I did not think it was going to be this entertaining to read. I did not expect the stories to be interesting, to be honest. And the way that he describes some of these things and the labels even that he applies to some of the stuff is kind of quirky and fun in a way that you maybe wouldn't expect from a behavioral designer, right on the cover, BJ Fogg, PhD. And I found it pretty refreshing, actually, in order to read it. I've already mentioned there's a lot of aha moments in here for me. Right in the first chapter, that Fogg behavior model, that was kind of interesting and unlocked a lot of things where it's like, oh, so that's why I never really thought that this was great, or aha, that's why that really clicks, and cements this for me. I really enjoyed this book. I think there's a ton visually in here, which makes it easy to read. It's not dry at all, even though there is kind of the deepest dive into habits that we've probably seen yet. I feel like this is one of the easiest books to get through too. Comparing this to Atomic Habits is interesting because I feel like towards the end of Atomic Habits, it feels pretty weighty. Like there's a lot of information that you've gone through and you can kind of lose sight of how it all ties together, even though he's really just basically attacking all the different angles on like the 4 different points and the 4 different laws in that particular book. I think that this is an easy 5-star book. I don't think that means that it's better or worse than Atomic Habits or any of the other 5-star books that we've read. But I do think for the right person, which I think is probably the majority of people who are interested in building solid habits, this is the go-to book. I'm thinking of one person in particular who texted me while I was reading this, and they mentioned that they're not a runner. They want to run a 10K. And so they bought a whole bunch of gear, and their plan was just to run until they couldn't every day for a period of time. And as I was hearing them talk about that, I'm reading through this, and I'm like, nope, you're doing this, and that wrong.
You're toast.
And here's the visual models. Yeah, exactly. But also it was interesting because I'm not in a position, I don't have the platform basically to say like, well, that's not the way that you should do this. But I found myself in the middle of reading this wanting to give it away to somebody because I know that the way BJ Fogg describes it and the visuals that he applies in this book, like they will totally get it.
Sure.
So I think this is a great book. I really don't I'm having trouble thinking of somebody who would not get a lot out of this book or who would not enjoy it. I guess if you fall into that camp where like the Antidote, Oliver Berkman, where you're just annoyed by the positive stuff, there is a lot of positive stuff in here. So maybe if you are like anti that, stay away. But otherwise, I think this is a great book.
Sure. I will join you at 5 stars. I think it definitely falls into that category. But I also think every time we have a habit book, we rate it at 5 stars. So there is that. So if we find another habit book, we should probably just rate it at 5 stars before we pick it up to read it. So in this case, I think he's, from a style stance, he's an awesome writer, very easy to read. The way the book is laid out and formatted, super simple to follow. The charts and stuff he uses and reuses with tweaks in order to make it a point spot on. I was annoyed by the PowerPoint slide thing I mentioned earlier that was purely in my head, not his thing at all, did not actually exist in the book, just a thing that my brain would not let go of. That is not his fault. So don't get upset over that. But the book is laid out really well. I liked it, and I'm likely to review this one from time to time just because seeing the motivation, ability, and prompt format and in that formula, it's super helpful. So that's one that I think I'm going to continue to fall back to. So I am excited that I have had a chance to go through this. I'm likely to recommend it in quite a few avenues. So thanks for picking it, Mike. Good job, sir.
Absolutely. All right. So upcoming books. What is next?
All right. So upcoming book is Stillness is the Key by Ryan Holiday, which is interesting that I had picked this ahead of time because given the conversation we just had about how my tendency to focus on fear and disappointment and stuff as motivators, I have a feeling this is going to cover some of that. You've read this, right?
I have. Yep. This is a good book.
So
I'm excited to talk about this one.
Yeah. I'll leave it there. Stillness is the Key by Ryan Holiday. I'm excited about going through this one, Mike.
All right. And the one after that, I am going to pick, because I just can't get enough about habits, Triggers by Marshall Goldsmith.
All right. So is it a 5 star? Do we need to rate it now?
I don't think so, but I haven't read it yet. I have heard Mike Hurley and CGP Grey talk about it on Cortex because they did it for the Cortex.
Oh, interesting.
Book
I didn't know that. That's right. They do a book club. Sometimes I forget that.
They do. This is one that I've had for a while. And this is, I'm assuming, just looking at the triggers / prompts part of the habits and routines, but also think that there's a lot of changes that could be made there in my specific scenario. So I was going back and forth between that one and the Power of Positive Thinking, which I think we do need to cover at some point because we keep talking about the antidote and the benefit of the negative side. I want to just address the positive side from somebody who really understands it, but at some point.
Yeah, for sure. Any Gap books this time? Life's been hard.
It's true. I do have some Gap books. So the first one I want to get through is I want to reread How to Take Smart Notes now that I think Rome might be a digital Zettelkasten that would actually work for me. But the other one, which is not very long, and I actually have right here, is Charles E. Hummel's Freedom from the Tyranny of the Urgent. This is a short book, which I am hoping to get to if I get done with How to Take Smart Notes. But I'm going to at least read that one because Stillness is the Key I know is going to be a quick read for me. I've read it already, and I really enjoyed it when I read it the first time. I know that rereading it is going to be quick.
Yeah. I do not have a Gap book. Life is nuts. I'm still not there. Yes.
How to Stay Alive by Joe Buhler.
Exactly. Yep. And yet I still explore new ideas mentally constantly. So, whoops. Here we go.
All right. Well, we mentioned it already, but just real quickly, you can support the show by becoming a member of the premium membership, which you can do at club.bookworm.fm/membership, I believe. And $5 a month will get you access to the live recordings, the MyNode files for the books that we read, some fancy wallpapers, our undying gratitude, and is a great way to support the show. So thank you to everybody who is willing to throw some money at allowing Joe and I to continue to do this.
You also get a little bit of inside baseball before and after the actual podcast recording.
That's true, yep.
Because we have a tendency to talk for a little bit before and after. So if you're on the live, you definitely get some of that as well. So thank you to everyone who is currently listening to us live and who joins us in the future. I need to make that easier to find. But yes, bookworm.fm/membership. And if you are reading along with us and you are joining or picking up the books so that you can read with us and actually have the full background as we go through them, the next book up is Stillness is the Key by Ryan Holiday, and we will go through that one next time.